Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the weekly web show for student affairs professionals in higher education. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live network. Tune in to Student Affairs Live every other Wednesday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time and join in the conversation today on Twitter using the Higher Ed Live hashtag. I'm your host, Tony Doody. I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home at Rutgers University. And I'm delighted to be serving as a co-host of Student Affairs Live with my good friend and colleague, Heather Shea Gasser. Also fortunate today to have the multitasking genius of Robin Janice monitoring the back channel today on Twitter. And in a moment, I'll introduce you to my guest, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. Higher Ed Live is sponsored and produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with educational institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. And our recent sponsor, ACPA, is honored and delighted to join with Higher Ed Live, SA Live, in catalyzing the conversations at the most critical intersections of our lives as student affairs professionals. Our work is layered, complicated, and life-changing for students and for each one of us. We need a place to gather and talk and listen deeply. No one in higher education should miss this opportunity to rethink and reset with Heather Shea Gasser and me, Tony Doody. So finally, I'm pleased to have joined me today four inspirational leaders in higher education. For those viewing the show, full biographies of our guests are on the Higher Ed Live website. Marsha, Elizabeth, Willie, and Donna, thank you so much for joining me today. I have been really looking forward to today's conversation. And I want to start off by asking you each to briefly share with us your name, your institution, organization, current role, and your favorite dessert. We'll start off with Marsha.
Hi, I'm Marsha Herman-Betzen. I am the current Executive Director of the Association of College Unions International, and any flavor of ice cream is my favorite dessert.
Excellent. Okay, and next up, who wants to go next? Elizabeth.
Sure, I'm Elizabeth Beltramini. I am Director of Content Curation for ACUI, and I oversee ACUI's diversity and inclusion efforts. And my favorite dessert is probably creme brulee.
Oh. Okay, Willie.
Good afternoon. My name is Willie Banks. I'm the Interim Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs at Cleveland State University, and my favorite dessert would have to be, it's a toss-up. I know you were supposed to do one, but a brownie or a lemon bar.
Wow. We've got great diversity in our desserts so far. Donna, how about you?
Hi, I'm Donna Lee. I'm the Vice President for Student Life and Dean of Students at Agnes Scott College, located in Decatur, Georgia. And my favorite dessert would be anything chocolate.
I'm with you. I'm on the chocolate. So, thank you all for those introductions. And I want to share the impetus for today's discussion came from a global diversity and inclusion benchmarking report that Marsha shared at a recent Big Ten, Pac-10, Big 12 Union and Activity Directors Conference. Now, we'll get into the details of the report in just a moment, but for those unfamiliar, it features 280 benchmarks across 13 different categories that was used to help evaluate ACUI's diversity and inclusion efforts. Now, the approach in the report kind of reminded me of that old adage, it's hard to manage what you can't measure, and I'm sure there are other approaches to these issues, but it struck me that this process could be replicated not just for higher ed associations, but really all of academia. So, Marsha, can you tell us a little bit about what led you to begin this initiative in the first place?
Absolutely, Tony. Well, first of all, for somebody who's been in the association grappling with this for 30 years, we had a board member who was able to pass on this instrument, and we got very, very excited about the instrument because it was the first time we could wrap our head around something that was not out there, that was able to break it down, give us a benchmark. We loved the definitions of diversity and inclusion. We weren't going to argue about definitions. We love that. We love the fact that these were international benchmarks, and the fact that we could really see where we were and give us something to work toward. And so Liz and Willie were both on the committee that worked to put this into practice and to send out the study. What is really fascinating then is the results. And I'm going to let them talk a little bit about the results, because we didn't do as well as we thought we might do in some areas, and we did far better than we thought we would do in some areas. But then the real challenge then came with what the recommendations were, and were we going to put our money and our effort to do something about it. And that's the real that is what remains to be seen. So I'd really love Liz and Willie to talk about the instrument and just give a quick synopsis of the instrument and what they did with it at the beginning.
Sure. Liz, you want to start off, talk a little bit about the process?
Sure. So the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks, as Marsha said, there are several categories, and we looked at almost all of the categories. There were a couple that we left out because they didn't apply directly to ACUI space, but they range from infrastructure, do you have the systems in place, is your education on point, what sort of workforce do you have? How are you encouraging supplier diversity? What does diversity look like in terms of your marketing efforts and your brand? So within each of these categories, there's 4 different levels of benchmarks. There's the we're really not doing anything in this area, so 0%. There's the 25% that says we're doing a little bit, we could be doing more. The 50% is really average, and then 75 and 100% are more the we are rocking this out of the park. And I should say there's a 2011 version of the benchmarks that we used. Since that time, the 2014 benchmarks have been released, and these are free. You have to sign a permission form request to use the benchmarks, but it's a really fantastic tool to just go through without having to self-define what is good. You have a parameter for what good looks like. So we took the benchmarks and basically looked at our documents, our workforce. We looked at our procedures from training, from evaluation. We looked at past evaluations, past educational content that we put together. And then to fill in any holes, we conducted 3 short surveys. One went to our leadership, our volunteer leadership, one went to our paid staff workforce, and the other went to the general membership not included in the volunteer leadership. And from there we were basically able to determine where we placed against each of these benchmarks.
Excellent, thank you. To give our audience, our viewers, kind of a foundation for the terms diversity and inclusion, Donna, can you elaborate or define from your perspective what those words mean for us?
Sure. I mean, when I think about diversity, I like to think about like, who's at the table across the spectrum, the various identities and differences, and what that brings. When I think about inclusion, what I like to think about then is how those voices at the table are brought in a way that everyone feels heard and honored and valued, in a way that you know, they feel they share the space. So that's how I differentiate. Well, they're connected and they're different.
Anyone else have a perspective or anything to add to that definition?
If I can, would it be all right, Tony, if I shared the inclusion definition from?
That'd be great.
Because I thought for me it resonated. So inclusion in the diversity and inclusion benchmark study refers to how diversity is leveraged to create a fair, equitable, healthy, and high-performing organization or community where all individuals are respected, feel engaged and motivated, and their contributions toward meeting organizational and societal goals are valued. So it's exactly what Donna said, but I just think it was worth really emphasizing that definition. And then the diversity definition was diversity refers to the variety of differences and similarities, dimensions among people, such as gender, race, ethnicity, tribal, indigenous origins, age, culture, generation, religion, class, caste, language, education, geography, nationality, disability, sexual orientation, work style, work experience, job role and function, thinking style, and personality type. And so for me, when I saw both the definition of diversity and of inclusion from somebody who grew up in the 60s, where those definitions were very different for me than the definitions today, it really resonated that I needed some work.
Mm-hmm. And what I think your definitions make clear is that when you talk about diversity, it could be a very stagnant concept. When we talk about inclusion, it's making it more active, more dynamic.
Yeah, I really appreciate that definition, Marsha. I don't think people think quite as broadly when we say the words or we throw out the words, particularly at our institutions, that it represents such a wide range. And you know, part of the conversation that we had when we were at the conference was how can we use this for our institutions? And Willie, I want you to talk for a moment, if you will, about how diversity can enhance an institution and what gets lost when we don't have a diverse community.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a great question, and I think it's important to understand that when we look at diversity, and especially on a college campus, it really should, it enhances everyone, because what we're doing is bringing together people from different backgrounds, and everyone has a different story and a different point of view, and I think our institutions are really enhanced and are for the better when we can actually allow those voices to be heard and people to share their experiences and also provide a different point of view. So if we just take this from a really small perspective as far as why is diversity important for my office, if everyone thought about issues the same way that I did, that's not a good management tool, but then also that's just not good practice, because everyone comes to the table with a different perspective. And I think when I look at that question or hear that question, I always go back to we don't want groupthink. We need to make decisions that are educated, that pull in from different perspectives, and I think diversity really pulls that in. What happens when we don't have those diverse opinions and diverse people around the table? I think that sometimes we go down the road and we make some wrong decisions. We're really not looking out for the greater good. We're really being very narrow in our perspective as far as this is what I believe, and I'm going to put my values and beliefs on my organization and then onto my institution, without really acknowledging that there are many voices that are around the table, and what are we doing as an institution to encourage those voices, but then taking a step further and saying, let's do something about those voices. It's one thing to be heard, but then it's also, so I think it's a bigger step to take what's being said and actually doing something with that information. And sometimes people just stop at, I want to hear what you have to say, but I'm not going to do anything with it.
Excellent. Hence the title, Rhetoric to Reality, right? What are some of the action steps? So,
absolutely.
So I'll throw this out to Elizabeth or Marsha, and Willie, you were part of the process, so you can certainly jump in. And Marsha, you indicated that some of the areas, or maybe Elizabeth indicated some of the areas of the report surprised you as being strong and some as being areas that were in need of improvement. Could you share with our audience some of those areas? And then to Willie's point, what are some specific steps that you think you might take as an association as a result of the initiative?
So I'll let Liz talk about where some of the places where we fall short and where some of the places we do better, and then I'll let Willie maybe could talk about some of the recommendations, and then I'll tell you where it landed after the board. How about that?
That sounds great.
Okay.
Sure. So initially, I think the strongest areas are in terms of our infrastructure and in terms of our vision. Similar to what you might find on campus, I don't think anyone today can say diversity or inclusion is not important. So everyone understands that there's a place for diversity and inclusion. Where it maybe doesn't meet expectations is that when diversity is everyone's responsibility, it's no one's responsibility. And so without a clear action plan, without clear resources, training, an assessment plan to figure out what the metrics are and how we were making improvement in those areas, and then communication of what we're doing, what it's changing, the positive outcomes, how you can get involved. Those are really the pieces where we needed some work. So the concept in general, everyone's on board. Some of those action steps and more operationalizing of diversity and inclusion is where now we have these recommendations to make some changes.
Right, and I think one of the biggest areas that, one of the biggest recommendations from the report, and there were other colleagues who have been involved with ACUI who served on this committee with myself and Liz, where we really landed was we really needed the association and the board to really talk about diversity and inclusion, and then actually hiring a staff member to address those issues, to work with our association members, the regional level, at the regional level, to really talk about what does diversity and inclusion mean, and then also to sort of spearhead that process. I think that's probably the biggest piece of that. Other pieces as far as marketing communication, being inclusive about our language, and I think that we've done a good job on the surface, but I think when you start digging down and start peeling back some layers, there is some room for improvement in every organization. But I think for the most part, the biggest piece was we need a staff person to really be the champion and sort of lead this initiative and help the association and its members. I'll turn it back to Marsha.
So the board went through each of the recommendations and then said in theory, we pass all of this. We agree we need to do what the report has said, and a lot of time has been spent. And so now we'll turn this over to the central office to find out how we can incorporate this and find the money to do what we need to do.
Great.
So that's what we're doing right now. The truth is we have not been able to find the money for a full-time person right off the bat, but what we have done is we found a phenomenal program, and we found somebody who is really interested in learning what she can, and that is Liz, who is attending. Liz, why don't you just talk about, I'm sorry, I'm taking your job, Tony, and all of a sudden I become a moderator, and I can't use this.
Oh, Marsha.
Knock it off. About the Cornell program that you're just attending, because here's the thing for your listeners is that we've got to find a way. We can't just say it's all or nothing, and we say, well, if we don't have the money, we got to forget about it. We have to find ways to work on this, and it can't be all or nothing. And so, you know, there's ways we have to find that we can, little by little, start to do some of the things to change these benchmarks for ACUI. So Liz, tell them what we did with you.
Sure. So in the short term, I've been working on a diversity and inclusion management certificate through Cornell University. They have a really fantastic program. There's really only 3 or 4 programs in the United States that focus on this. And the biggest part that I found is that these are issues that every industry deals with. And so what's been really exciting is the cross-disciplinary conversations. So similar to what you all have on your campus, there are things happening in the corporate sector that we can learn from in higher education. And there are practices in government that we can translate to association management. And so having the opportunity to get outside of, you know, our circle or our comfort zone and really explore what's being done in other areas and then translate that back to our work has been sort of the biggest bang for our buck in the short term, because there are really great things that are going on. The IRS has some really great diversity and inclusion practices. I maybe had never thought of them as a leader in this area. The Deloitte is really exciting in terms of what they do in training and helping to get their workforce to understand inclusion versus just diversity. So these are just examples, but I think the biggest lesson has been that we don't have to go to the same sources. We can't afford to hire a full-time staff person right now, and so how do we maximize our knowledge base affordably? And that's the same challenge that everyone has in student affairs, not on college campuses.
I really appreciate the sentiment of people. Marsha and I had this conversation in Ohio. People often think you've got to go all in, but it's really a series of steps, and we can all do our part in affecting change in this area. And I also appreciate the fact that you looked outside of the higher education industry for some best practices. Certainly something that we can all stand to benefit from in student affairs in general. Now I want to bring this back to the institutions. And Donna, you've been at a few schools. What are some of the indicators of institutional culture that really demonstrate a commitment to diversity and inclusion? I'm not just talking about the words. I'm talking about what kind of tangible evidence can you point to that would indicate a good institutional culture in this area?
Mm-hmm. I think when we think about an institutional culture that is truly committed to diversity and inclusion, the things that you would see reflected would be in the ways, let's say even the curriculum. Does the curriculum span a wide range of histories, traditions, culture, looking at not just what is being taught, how is it being taught, is it taught in different contexts, or is it taught in different ways that would reach a diverse student body? Who is doing the teaching? Can you look into the structures and see diversity reflected throughout, both in positions of power and authority and throughout the student body? Do students have opportunities to reflect on their own heritage, their own history? Do they have opportunities to engage across difference, both in and out of the classroom? Is that continual assessment happening where the institution is always taking a look at what is the climate, what's missing, where are the gaps, and taking action against to address that? Now, I will say that too, it's easier said than done. It's a continual process. It's a process of continually looking inward and being open to when you get, and in fact it goes back to what Willie was saying, was what do you do when you hear the voices? So if you are truly committed to that inclusion, when you get the feedback that people do not feel included, what are you doing then to address it? So it's a continual process. It's staying on top of it, and each one of the members willing to do their own personal work and engaging in that process.
So, Willie, a question that came up as I was exploring this topic is should our institutions of higher ed reflect society, or should we be consciously trying to shape society? And I've struggled with, are we looking to have a representation of in organizations of our institution, of the state, of the nation, of the world? Like, what are we looking to achieve here?
Well, I think it's just an interesting question, and I would actually say that you could do both. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think our institutions should reflect society and the population that we're serving. So things that Donna has already mentioned, but I think good indicators are what do the faculty look like? What do your staff members look like? What does your upper administration? And what do your students look like? And I think a large part of that is we need to reflect. And you know, I'm at Cleveland State. I'm at an urban institution, very diverse. We're talking 25% diversity here across the spectrum. And I'll just share a quick story. Speaking about identity, you know, the institution, one of the ways that I think that is really interesting is that our institution adopted, through the board of our board of trustees, added gender identity and gender expression into the non-discrimination policy in March to no fanfare. They just did it. It was part of, and I was surprised coming from the University of Georgia, where that, I mean, we struggled with that for a number of years, and a lot of my, you know, friends and colleagues at other institutions struggled with that. And now I'm at this institution where they added it in with, like, it was just like a, you know, no one thought anything about it. Everyone voted yes, of course, we should do that. So that says a lot, and I think that's interesting because I think that reflects society and where we currently are in Northeast Ohio is being very diverse, lots of different people here. Cleveland hosted the Gay Games this summer, so that speaks volumes. The second part of your question, should we consciously shape the society? Absolutely, because I think you know, what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to educate the whole student. And I think when they step foot on campus, if that student's not exposed to different people, different ideas, different philosophies and beliefs, then we're not doing a good job of preparing them to operate in society. I've always shared with friends, and I've shared with some students, and they would come to me and say, you know, I don't like so-and-so, I'm not sure this is right. And I said, you know, unless you are just a multimillionaire, you're going to report to someone and work for someone your entire life. And unless you live on a small island by yourself, you're going to have to really learn how to work with people and appreciate who they are. So I think it's our job that we really have to do a good job of shaping these minds and these bodies, these souls, really looking at the whole student. But we can do both. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. We can do both.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
And you know, I think that one of the things when Liz came home from Cornell that we had this wonderful discussion, and she was talking about one of the concepts that they shared with her about how the 60s was more of opening doors to women and minorities, and then the 70s and 80s were about opening minds to diverse perspectives. But today, it's about opening systems to diverse individuals in the broadest sense of diversity. And so what do we do on our campuses to make sure, or in our associations, that we open systems and that we have that diversity of thought? And it's not necessarily about counting people. Mm-hmm. Of how we look, but it's the diversity of thought that makes us so much better. Liz, what was the story you told me about? I love this one of Procter & Gamble and the diapers. I know she just hates telling this story again, but I think this is such a poignant story about diapers.
I can't remember.
Oh, I know. You don't. Okay, so they didn't have any women research and development people at Procter & Gamble at a time when, you know, because at that time men didn't change diapers. And all of a sudden they brought in some women who for the first time, and it wasn't because they were women, but guess what? They changed diapers, and that's what came up with Pampers, the paper diaper. So it wasn't the fact that they were women. It was a business paradigm, and it was because they had diversity of thought that made the organization better. and it became a business imperative. So I think we forget sometimes why diversity is important. It makes us better, and it's the diversity of thought that those women brought to the table, not the fact they were women. If that makes any sense.
No, that's a great story, and looking at outside industry, I can tell you that I analyzed Indianapolis pit crews to help better change diapers of my 3 boys. All about speed and efficiency, right? So, with the acknowledgement that every institution is different, so maybe, Willie, you come you're at an institution now that seems much more diverse than where you were at Georgia, and certainly there are institutions that are more homogeneous than others. I can imagine viewers sitting here and saying, I can't really affect change. I'm a new professional or I'm a mid-level professional. This is something that has to be done from the highest ranks. How do you respond to that? What are some specific actions that anyone, regardless of your place on the hierarchy, on the org chart, can take, and what are some of the obstacles that we need to overcome to be more effective in this area?
Well, I think people need to step out of their comfort zone and also realize it's everyone's responsibility, and we just can't say that person of color or the person who identifies as XYZ is going to be the champion. We all have to do this together, or it will never change, because it really takes small steps. What I've discovered in my career is that sometimes we idealize this and we want the big sweeping changes, but realistically, sometimes that can happen, but the most change that I've seen when we're talking about changing culture and changing minds and people, it takes small instances. It takes people to spend time to create open environments where people can share their thoughts. Then also, because a lot of people are vulnerable about this. They don't want to admit that they feel or they're not knowledgeable about a certain area, and they just have questions, but they hold a lot of that in. I sound very much like a counselor today. And so what we have to do is really create an environment where people can share an open, safe space where they can ask questions, really explore who they are as people, and really create those environments. My advice to young professionals and new mid-level professionals, you've got to be intentional about what you can do as far as student leaders. What is your locus of control? What can your sphere of influence? When we're talking about student organizations, I have that conversation. Are we making sure that we're reaching out to our affinity groups, to making sure that they understand that these opportunities exist for them to participate? So that's something that they can control. Instead of just looking at a specific sorority or one leadership society, you've got to look at other groups. You've got to work with other people, and you've got to get people to identify other students that may really blossom and really can bring a different perspective. So I think there are ways for our new professionals to contribute. You just have to be intentional about it, and you have to use your voice. And I say use your voice, but many times I think our new professionals are still trying to figure out what they're trying to say. So it takes time. So I would say be patient, but be open, and raise your hand and say something once you feel comfortable.
And I would just add to that, be curious. Go ahead and ask the question of why do we do it this way? Because maybe there is a good reason, and maybe there's a reason that doesn't make sense today, but you're not going to know the answer unless you ask. And it's okay to be curious, and it's okay to wonder why. And when you're asking a question, sometimes there is that vulnerability because you don't know the answer. You're asking for the answer. So also own that it's okay not to know the answer. And you're going to make mistakes. And you just have to keep trying. You're going to say the wrong thing to the wrong person. You are going to be the white girl talking about race. But you have to be willing to put yourself out there, because everybody has their own identity issues, and you just have to start the conversation.
Her husband, Liz's husband, couldn't believe we were sending Liz to a diversity workshop at Cornell. They said, could we find anyone more white and pasty than Liz to send to a diversity workshop? And I think that you were not the only white person, were you, Liz?
No, and I would say that there were some good conversation around that, because there are white men that also wonder, how am I supposed to be taken with any credibility in these conversations, because they've been privileged all their life. And I think that we all have to. It's on everybody. It's not just the people of color or the people, as Willie said, who identify as XYZ.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other, and I appreciate what you're sharing. I think where we mess up really is when we engage in the conversation, we don't enter the conversation with a heart that is willing to be gentle and to forgive. And so I shared earlier, it really is about a journey. And people are at different points in that journey. There's some people who are just realizing the privilege that they have. So I appreciate you even just saying that, ask the questions, be curious. But at the same time, I would say that as you might be a person hearing someone asking questions and someone is coming to you being curious, that we need to learn how to listen with ears that recognize that curiosity and that willingness to learn and engage. I think that's where the dialogue starts to fail, is that there's a lot of judgment, there's a lot of, just judgment. And so I think for us to really be able to have a meaningful dialogue, it needs to be done in the spirit of, everyone is in this journey together.
And when you hear the word privilege, I think I've heard people become very defensive and say, well, I didn't grow up with a lot of money. Well, we're not talking about money when we talk about privilege. We're talking about the ability for me to walk in anywhere with a hoodie or not with a hoodie on, or a young man who is African American not have the ability, and the conversations that my friends have who are African American with their sons, that my friends who are white would not have to have with their son, about the kind of attire they would wear, or if they're stopped, how they would act. That's what we're talking about, privilege. And those are the kinds of discussions that we have to have openly. And those are some of the kinds of discussions that we can openly have. So I think that once we can really talk about some of these things, I think that's when we have the chance to really move forward. And I wanted to go back to one of the things Tony said. One of the reasons I really like the Global Diversity and Inclusion benchmarking report is that I don't have to wait for the university, or I don't have to wait for the world. I can just take my little corner, my little association, and try to make it better. Just even the central office, I can benchmark and try to have an effect. Once I broke that down for us, it made it easier for me to feel like I was doing something. And I wasn't having to wait for the bigger world that I did not have the influence on. And so I think if other associations looked at it and said, well, I can just do it in ACPA, in NASPA, in ACUHOI, or if I could do it in this college union or in this residence hall, if we all could do that, then maybe together as a conglomerate, we would start to have change some real behavior. So for me, that's what was important about this particular report.
I really appreciate that, and what Willie said about sphere of influence, right? We only have control over what we have control or influence, but we can all take a part in impacting change, and then maybe other people notice around us and above us, and then it becomes something much larger than the original spark or seed of an idea. Now, some of the other partners in this are really the faculty, and some of the recent research have suggested that faculty serve a much more important role in influencing students' attitudes and values than we had previously thought. So, because student affairs professionals have so much contact with students, we often hear about classroom concerns and experiences, particularly in regards to issues of climate acceptance and inclusion. So, is it the responsibility and role of student affairs to provide support and guidance to faculty? And if not, who does that? Who is it at the university? For anyone.
I mean, I'm not sure if I would frame it as a formal responsibility, but I think as educators, once you become aware and you have the knowledge and ability to affect change, that's where you make that happen. You know, and so it's in starting that dialogue, it's in pointing out where there are the gaps, it's in having a conversation with either individual faculties or the folks who make decisions around what happens in the classroom, and naming what's happening and sharing the concerns that you're hearing from students, in offering to be a partner in shaping environments that are more inclusive, in being a resource if education and support is needed. You know, it's finding those ways that you're demonstrating that you want to partner in that education process. You know, that's how I see it.
And I think Donna is really hitting on it, because I think what has happened is a lot of the work that we're doing as student affairs professionals, sometimes we get that entry into the classroom via, you know, unfortunately, students who are acting out in class, or, you know, students who are being disruptive. And also a lot of times our faculty members are not equipped to actually deal with that. So some of the entryways for student affairs into the faculty affairs arena is really dealing with disruptive students. And so what I try to do is frame it into a larger picture and larger context, as far as you may know nuclear physics, but you also need to know that you're going to deal with a diverse student body, internationally, gender, you know, across the spectrum. But some of our faculty members really fail at knowing how to manage that. And so what I've discovered is it's really everyone's responsibility, from the provost to the colleges, the college deans, the Center for Teaching and Learning. We have to educate our faculty members on who is actually coming to our institution. And sometimes if you're not really intentional about saying, okay, faculty member, this is the demographic. These are the students that are coming here. If you are not comfortable dealing with a 25% international student body, and you're having problems with that, we need to have a discussion about what you're going to do in your day-to-day life and work, and if this is a good fit. Because what we're finding is you've got to be prepared for this. So faculty members in the classroom, they have to, and you know, I think we're the content experts on this, but we need to partner with our multicultural offices, diversity inclusion offices. It's everyone's responsibility to really educate those faculty members on really dealing with diverse populations. That's what it boils down to. It's everyone's responsibility.
And go ahead, Liz.
I think one of the real opportunities that is out there is because so many student affairs professionals are also adjunct faculty, there's an opportunity for those conversations to happen in an informal and a formal way, just because of that relationship. And we don't often think about that being a vantage point for a diversity and inclusion conversation to happen. But we have knowledge as student affairs practitioners that faculty members might not. If you're serving in an adjunct role, that gives you a voice at the table to begin with. So that's just something else I would add.
And I was going to say that I think we also have a responsibility, if we manage buildings, to make those buildings reflect the diversity around us. So the kind of art we hang in our buildings, the kind of food we serve in our buildings, the kind of programs that we have in our buildings says, I want you to feel like it is comfortable. You know, that goes back to, you know, I want to be part of that program because there are people who look like me in that building. But I think that sense, you can't speak out of both sides of your mouth. So you have to be able to be very cognizant of what our facilities look like and whether they really say welcome. And then I would I would piggyback on what Willie says about partnering. I think partnerships, we all want the same thing, and that's the education of the student. And we might go about it from different perspectives, but that's what we want of the whole student. And so how we go about that, if we have to reach out to the faculty, let's find more and more ways that we can partner to make sure that happens.
So along that line, I want to pull a question that came to us from Twitter from Victoria Farris, who asks, or says she's interested in how folks should engage students in this conversation, and are we listening to their perspective on inclusion?
I personally think students are more ready for the conversation than we are. I think they're waiting for us to create the space for it to happen. And so a lot of it really is nourishing those spaces where students feel like they, in a safe way, can explore their own identity, can test and challenge their beliefs and their perspectives and ideas, can hear and learn from others. They're waiting for us. I mean, I just have never found where students don't want to engage in that process. Where I think where we might shut it down is when we don't address and challenge when there's a point where we need to be more supportive, or we might need to help to educate, because it's messy. I mean, I said that earlier. It's messy, and we just have to be willing to go into the mess with them.
Anyone else? So Marsha, you brought up programming and facilities and really, putting your words into action, and it reminded me. I was fortunate enough to hear you, Willie, speak at Ohio State at the conference, the ACUI conference, and you talked about making sure that we adequately resource our diverse programming, and it gave me pause and had me come back and have conversations with our folks here at Rutgers. But if someone comes and says we want more diverse programming, how should people make meaning of that? What does that look like on our campuses?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because I think we're all faced with that question when someone says, I want more diverse programming. What does that mean? And you're going to have to, we're each going to have to take it apart and really pull apart and try to get to the core of what they're looking for. Because in my experience, there's some offices that deal with multicultural programming that are not resourced well, and they are really trying to educate, and it's like feeding the world with like $1. So what are we going to do to support them? So I think what you have to do is really ask questions of that person, find out and manage expectations as far as what can I do as a unit head for this part of the university. Is it through providing funding? Is it through comping space? Is it through providing our services? Is it hosting a speaker or an artist coming to campus? We just got to be intentional about it, and we just can't be really flip. And I think, and I'll own this, I think in my past positions, when folks would come, I was like, well, you've got to come to the table with the same amount of money. If we're going to be equal partners in this, my expectation was, well, people were going to show up with the same amount of money in their budget to do these co-programs. And as I've learned over years, they're the haves and the have-nots. And sometimes I was in the seat where I had all the money, and I was working with $1 million budgets, and these other offices were not. And it took a long time for me for it to click to say, Willie, you really need to think about how you approach this work and working with your campus partners, because not everyone has all the resources. So I really think when they come to me now, it's really, let's talk about this. What are some meaningful ways for me to involve students, but then also professional staff, and how can I make a difference? Because sometimes I'm the one with the pot of money, and people are coming to me, and it's my responsibility to help where I can.
So one of the conversations that I had was with our students on the programming board, and their pushback was, well, what does diverse programming look like in music or in entertainment or comedy? You know, and the pushback, of course, was rap does not represent African Americans. Right? We had Chance the Rapper here a few weeks ago, and I can assure you that there were many more diverse populations than African Americans present at that conference, at that concert. So how could I respond to these students who are pushing back and saying, what do I do with that?
Well, and here's the thing, and I was a programmer for a number of years, and I had this conversation with my students all the time, and I always brought it back to, let's look at our funding source. This money is from our student body, and we have a responsibility to really look at a slate of programming that addresses all of our students. And so when I talk to our students about programming, I really emphasize that it has to be a diversity of programming. There was one semester where our lecture board had a slate of men. And I literally looked at them and said, what in the world, you know, where's the diversity here? Nothing against men, but we need some diverse opinions here. And they looked at me and they were like, well, what are you talking about? I was like, there are more than men that have voices and want to share their thoughts and views on the world. So I had to push back on them and say, you know, you've got to take that extra step. You really have to remember that your money and your funding model, you're representing all students. And all students, you know, we're going to have to do our best. We need to start thinking about, if we're looking at music, that rap music may not be the only genre. You may have to sit down and tell them, you need to start thinking about, if you're going to do a rap artist, let's think about the polar opposite, a country artist, a classical musician, and you've got to have a good balance of perspective. And I think that's their responsibility as a programming board, is to provide that perspective for the general student body. That's part of their responsibility. They're supposed to do that.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's important that those boards represent the student body. And so those boards sometimes are not diverse in themselves. So when they're at the table trying to think about what to program, it's through their own lens.
Yep. And you have to you as the professional have to really challenge your students, but that's where your job is to connect with those other offices on campus and get those students who may be in the Residence Hall Association or that are part of the Black Student Union, Hispanic Student Union, LGBT groups. You've got to go.
Or the Republicans.
Or the Republicans. You are absolutely correct, Marsha. To go and apply for these positions or to volunteer for these groups, because that's where their voice needs to be heard. And I think that's our responsibility, is to remind our staff members we have to get out there and really push our stuff.
Right, we can't wait for people to come to us.
Right.
That's the biggest thing. And we can't assume that, oh, if we put on a rap concert, then that's going to appeal to X audience, if we haven't done our homework to figure out what our students actually want.
So we've talked about strategies for programs and for facilities. How do we go about, and touched upon faculty, how do we go about developing a diverse pool of candidates for positions, whether it be for our associations or within our departments and our institutions? How do we broaden the pool? So some practical ideas.
Well, some of it I think is thinking outside the box. Where are we placing ads? Are we intentionally looking for ad placement around? I mean, there's so many different outlets. With the diverse, what's the name of the? There's a publication around diversity, diverse issues. I mean, ad placement of ads there, partnering with minority-serving institutions to tap into graduates from those institutions. I mean, it really is thinking outside the box. And then really thinking about what kind of messaging is sent out to a diverse candidate who might be looking at your institution. If they look at the institution, do they see themselves there? Could they thrive there at the institution? Are there sources of support for them when we bring them to campus? Are we thinking about things that they might be thinking about? I mean, thinking about myself as an African American woman, I'm going to be thinking about things like, what kind of neighborhoods am I going to live in? Where do I get my hair done? I mean, just are those kinds of things part of the interview process? Do I have opportunities to meet with diverse students where I can get a sense for the climate, what the climate is for them? As a faculty member, is there going to be an expectation that I'm going to be the mentor and advisor to all the students of color? And if that is the case, will that be counted as service? I mean, there's so many things, so many indicators that I think a person of color might be looking for when they come to an institution, but how open is the institution in helping to shape that space for them, where we're not just trying to recruit them, but we want to give the message that we want them to be able to thrive there.
I also think that we, in higher ed, we know we have a challenge. And I think we continually go back to the same well to drink. And I think just like we said, we have to learn and go outside of where we typically go, we have to do the same. So I think we can't keep going to the same places we typically go. And there are loads and loads of other sources that we might look besides higher education from some of these positions. So I would say, just like we are learning some best practices from Deloitte or from, you know, government, I think we have to go back to other places, because right now higher ed has some real challenges in the area of diversity.
So we're running down on time, and I want to give everyone a minute or two to share some final thoughts. And the question I want to pose is, if diversity and inclusion initiatives really lived up to their full potential in either organizations or institutions, what do you hope, what do you dream is possible within the next 5 years? What's the best case scenario that you might see?
Wow. Wow. Okay, first I will say 5 years is a really short time. But, no, it really is. It really is. But I think just continued dialogue. I think, and I know I keep repeating myself because it really is a journey and a process. It really, really is. And so my hope would be that more and more people will be willing to come to the table as their authentic selves, show up as who they are in all the beauty and even the messiness of what diversity is, and be willing to engage in dialogue, all willing with the same heart to creating spaces that are going to educate the whole student, so that that student goes out and wants to make a difference in the world and be very comfortable and proud of who they are. But I'm going to say again, Tony, 5 years is just right around the corner.
I'm a dreamer. Liz,
you know,
Marsha, really?
Oh, go ahead, Marsha.
Oh, well, you know, my days are numbered. I only have 23 more weeks. So
not to live as executive director.
Right, as executive director. So I have great hopes. I put a lot of faith in the younger. I keep putting faith in the younger generations. I do, who seem to keep coming to college with a lot less baggage than the generations that went before me, and certainly my generation. So I keep hoping that we will see differences start to subside. I hope that we will become smarter and smarter, and we will see systems of inclusion become more prevalent on campus. I agree with Donna, we have to keep the dialogue coming, but you know, 5 years, but who knows? You know, get rid of these boomers, and gosh knows what will happen as soon as we right off into the sunset. And it's not just the boomers. It's it's an attitude. It has nothing really to do with age. It's an attitude. But I do think open and honest dialogue, and exactly, Tony, programs like this where we can honestly continue to keep this topic on the forefront, because I can't see how you could become an educated human being if we cannot sit at the table and start to make our colleges and our universities a place for everyone.
Who's next?
Well, I would just say, somewhat to echo what's been said, I would hope that people begin to have a broader understanding of the changing demographics of higher education and specifically how they influence all of our work. I think people are aware that change is coming, but that's going to really be a wake-up call if we're not ready for it. And then on a personal note, I would just sort of take what Stephen Covey has said about impact and intent, and I think that there's a lot of conversations that need to happen in the D&I space, and we need to realize that sometimes what we intend isn't always the impact. And so if we come with an open mind and we're willing to listen and hear what the other person is saying and to be vulnerable in those conversations, I think we'll understand that people generally have good intentions. We just need to work on that impact.
All right, Willie, take us home.
All right. Well, and I agree with everyone, and everything that's been said has been wonderful stuff. I would say, for me, 5 years from now, it would be really wonderful if we looked at senior leadership, presidents, provosts, VPs, deans, and it reflects society, and that there really is an open door. And when we're talking about positions of power and influence, that there are a lot of different people around the table, and that there's some change being affected in a really meaningful way. I think one of the things that I think all of us have experienced that after a certain point in time, we talk about this a lot, but you really hope that some action and something meaningful happens, even in the small term. And so in 5 years, let's have some more women of color who are out, LGBT people as university presidents, and making a change on a college campus. But that's not to exclude anyone. But I would love to see that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, we are at the end of our time. I want to thank our guests, Marsha, Elizabeth, Willie, and Donna, really for an engaging and an open conversation here today. And also thanks to everyone who's been following along on Twitter and asking questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all those questions today. Certainly we'll look back at them and pass them on to our guests where appropriate. I will be returning on December 10th for another great show with my friend Eric Qualman and the Dean of Students at Boston University, Ken Elmore. And we're hoping to have a surprise guest, which I'll just tell you is President Ono from the University of Cincinnati, as we talk about the concepts of digital leadership and some of the messages from Eric Qualman's books, Socialnomics, and What Happens in Vegas Stays on YouTube. Also, please check out Heather Shea Gasser's upcoming show on December 3rd on trans student inclusion. And you can find me on Twitter for more information and details of upcoming guests. Until then, my name is Tony Doody. Make it a great week, and thanks again for watching all.